Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Duran, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness, racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
private property,
Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. In this episode, I am joined by Andres Arauz, arguably one of the most intriguing political and economic thinkers of the new Latin American left. We will be expanding on the last episode's discussion on the contemporary effects of the Latin American economic shock therapy and how it has changed the territorial and political dynamics of the South. We will also discuss the new progressive directions to counter the most recent privatization policies and the pandemic and post-pandemic socio-political battles in Latin America. Andres Arauz is an Ecuadorian economist, politician, and academic residing in Mexico City. This year, he was the progressive candidate for President of the Republic of Ecuador. He is the former General Director of the Central Bank of Ecuador, former Deputy Minister of Planning, and former Minister of Knowledge. Andres Arauz is a member of the Executive Council of Progressive International, an international organization uniting and mobilizing progressive left-wing activists and organizations. He is a founding member of the Dollarization Observatory and was a former board member of the nascent Bank of the South. Hello, Andres. Thank you very much for joining the podcast. I'm very curious to know what were your early experiences as you started working in the government of Rafael Correa a few years ago, specifically on the policy directions against neoliberal capital. Right. I mean, you worked at that time, you were the Central Bank of Ecuador, and you did a lot of moves to counteract sort of the effects of the privatization wave that was happening in Latin America due to the shock therapies that it received before. And I wonder if you can let us know a little bit, how did you confront that moment when you had suddenly the power to decide or to take decisions collectively with the political party? And what were the steps, that you tried to follow as you moved with anti-neoliberal policies?
Right. So the first point was to use the shock therapies that had been used in the past against the population as a turning point to gather massive political support for an anti-neoliberal agenda. And the first step was to garnish political support in the Constituent Assembly, right? The Constituent Assembly was a key defining moment in the history of Ecuador, and perhaps many countries in Latin America will take that as a reference point as well in the future, where we wrote a new constitution with massive citizens' participation, social movements, and so forth. And the constitution became basically a working plan, right? If you read the Ecuadorian constitution, it's not a sort of principle-based document. It's actually very detailed in its policy prescriptions, and it definitely sets a path forward. Now, with the constitution in place and with a doctrine called neo-constitutionalism, which basically says that you have to apply the constitution and not wait for rules and regulations and sort of normative steps to be implemented, but just act directly. We were able to implement very, very strong measures that would set the foundations of an anti-neoliberal agenda. First, the constitution made the central bank not independent in the sense that it has been sort of designed by the neoliberal establishment. So we made it part of the executive branch and therefore totally it had to be accountable to the population, to the democratic system. So the central bank quickly became a force for democratic change. And of course, with the central bank not being in the hands of the bankers or of the neoliberal technocrats, but in the hands of socialists, we were able to implement massive changes to what we call the financial architecture. So we created the popular and solidarity financial sector, which is basically the cooperative local finance sector in the rural areas and so forth. We gave that sector huge privileges within the central bank payment system, within access to government funding, access to the government platforms and services and so forth, that gave them the opportunity to compete with the large mega banks. We regulated the Ecuadorian capital account. So we were very strict in terms of how much money could leave the country, for example. We established taxes on speculative capital, especially cross-border capital flows, which allowed us to have, over 10 years of stability in the financial system without crises. We established caps on interest rates for consumer lending, for housing, for others. And that was very important in also giving certainty and stability to the productive sector, to small businesses and so forth, so they could take out loans without, ridiculous interest rates, and be able to also generate some more economic activity for the people. We took other measures that were very, very important by forbidding banks and bankers, so owners of banks, from being also owners of media companies, right? So media corporations.
Yes.
The bankers were not allowed to be owners of media companies. And that was very, very important, because the shock therapies of the past have been implemented with a lot of support from the media. And then when you scratched under the surface, you would find that the media companies belong to the banks. So that was very important in terms of changing the political economy of the situation in Ecuador. And then in terms of our relationship with the foreign capital, we basically did away with what are called the bilateral investment treaties, which are these international treaties that basically allow investors and transnational corporations to have impunity, because whenever there's government regulation, they can just sue an entire country, an entire government, in the World Bank's International Center for...
Just like with Argentina and many other countries.
And this is what's happening in Latin America right now with, for example, mining corporations that are destroying the environment. Some governments take, even timid reforms or regulations that establishing more environmental controls, or basically trying to avoid massive movements of people because of these mining operations. And the corporations just sue their countries with arbitrations, with private arbitrators at the World Bank. So we did away with all of those. And of course, that set a different way of relationship of the Ecuadorian government and its people with transnational corporations. We also restructured, we defaulted on Ecuador's foreign debt after what we call a citizens audit, where we, together with civil society and the government, analyzed, around 40 years of historical documents from the archives that were made public for the first time ever. And together also with investigation techniques, sort of forensics, we were able to determine that the negotiators on behalf of the government were actually bankers who had bonds,
a stake.
They had a stake in the negotiations with the use of offshore companies and the like in the US. So,
which is very common in Latin America.
Exactly.
Well, all over the world, especially for World Bank and so on.
So when people talk about anti-corruption efforts, this was perhaps the most radical anti-corruption transformation, which was to basically find out how the sovereign bonds had been issued and played with for over 2, 3, 4 decades. And of course, the citizens audit recommended declaring that debt as illegitimate, which is similar to the concept of odious debt that's been around. But illegitimate debt basically is a debt that cannot be paid, or at least cannot be paid in full. because of all these irregularities and because people have been betrayed in the process. So we defaulted on our commercial debt right in the middle of the 2008 crisis.
So tell me, Andres, this was like never heard before, right? I mean, I think you were one of the first countries to actually be able to say no to this kind of debt.
Well,
or what were the precedents that you were looking into?
I mean, the precedents had been around for millennia, because the Jubilee, which is the forgiveness of debt or the cancellation of debt, is an institution that you can even find in the Old Testament, the Torah. It's an institution of humanity to allow for a rebirth, an opportunity for a civilization to resolve massive inequality and to get a new chance of in the next sort of super cycle. So
Yeah.
that's not unheard of. In for example, another case that was very well known was the German debt conference in both before and after the Second World War, where basically the world decided to cancel and forgive the German external debt to give it a new chance to prosper and to develop. Similar cases have happened in domestic legislation for a long time. Even in the US, you have bankruptcy,
Of course.
regulations, but that hasn't been applied to sovereigns in the past to the extent that we made it happen. Now, what was innovative in Ecuador was the fact that we had a citizens audit of the debt. So allowing people, academics, experts, civil society, social movements to actually get into the books of the government, of the banks, and the central bank, and get that information out there. That's the kind of transparency and accountability that neoliberal establishment will never allow you to do, right? To let social movements get into the books of the Fed or the Treasury, deep down.
And how much do you point towards the dollarization of the Ecuadorian economy? Because a lot of our viewers also don't, or listeners, sorry, that don't know that Ecuador has been on a dollarized economy for some time, right? And that, I assume, played a very big role in the decisions, right? Or it was part of the strategy, right? That permitted this default, right? Because it could have had, or it still had, major sort of economic financial consequences, I assume.
Right. So Ecuador is dollarized since the year 2000. It was part of the shock therapy after the financial crisis of 1999. And basically, the people were, ransacked with this idea that we can't manage our own national currency, when it was, of course, the bankers who were managing the old currency called the sucre. And they convinced, it wasn't actually a thing of consensus, but the neoliberal party, which is now in government in Ecuador, by the way, they basically decreed, violating Ecuador's constitution, that the currency would be the US dollar. Now, for the neoliberals, this was a thing that they celebrated, because they thought that with dollarization came all of neoliberalism. But when we arrived to the government, we decided to take advantage of dollarization in unconventional senses, right? So as many countries in, for example, Europe, use the euro, but they are part of a treaty, they have the common central bank and so forth. We said, look, we're not binded by an international treaty. We unilaterally dollarized, so we can unilaterally change the conditions of dollarization.
Absolutely.
And we decided, okay, let's try to be as flexible as we can, taking advantage that we have a stable currency unit. That's a very important element in terms of the general population and the capacity to, foresee the planning and future and so forth. But we said, okay, let's try to create sort of the Ecuadorian money of the dollar. So the unit of account will still be the US dollar, but we're going to create new instruments in terms of new loans.
Yeah, you're going to appropriate it. Yeah.
We created the first central bank digital currency. It was called dinero electrónico. It was issued by the central bank, and every Ecuadorian citizen, Miguel, every Ecuadorian citizen had the right to an account at the central bank, right, in dollars, that would allow that person to move money around with the ease of just a few clicks on their phone. So this was fairly revolutionary at the time. This was thing despised by international bankers and also by the local elites, because of course we were proposing a way of democratizing the dollar access and electronic means of payment for the population, bypassing completely the oligopolistic dynamics of the
Yeah,
banking system. So
that's
we
crazy.
did that. We democratized the payment system at the central bank to allow cooperatives to and credit unions to have access to the payment system. We made a significant improvements on how dollars were recycled in the domestic economy. We created an outflow tax for anybody who wanted to take dollars out of the country. We regulated how private banks had to invest their liquidity so that not all of their money would flow outwards to Miami, New York, or Switzerland, but had to stay
Which
within
is
the
a very
country.
common thing in Latin America.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we were
Mhm.
fairly creative, applying heterodox economic policies to have the money recirculate in Ecuador. And we never had problems of inflation, never, never. Inflation was never a problem in our case, because we made sure that the money that was being recirculated was being spent and invested on productive ends and means. So that was a very successful experiment.
Yeah, and on that front, Andres, I mean, there's uh, I mean, after you defaulted on this, right? In development, in cases of territorial and urban development, a lot of the large-scale infrastructural projects that countries conduct, I mean, whether you call it dams or electric infrastructure, or communications infrastructure, ports, and so on, normally it's put together with this kind of debt, the kind of debt. So the World Bank, gets you, or the IMF puts you these loans that is dependent on having some kind of privatization arrangements with multinational corporations and infrastructure, right? What happened with all the sort of contracts and treaties that, especially on the side of development, territorial development, and so on, that were linked to such debt? And in which way were those contracts started to be, let's say, given away in a new kind of economy? What was the management strategy behind this?
Right. So then again, I have to part and begin with the Constitution. The Constitution established what are called strategic sectors of the economy, and very similar to the sort of old 60s and 70s Latin American thought, structuralist thought. And these strategic sectors were defined that only the government would be able to basically manage these strategic sectors, right? And there were, of course, several exceptions, but the overall trend was that the strategic sectors, so oil infrastructure, energy infrastructure, mining, telecommunications, electricity, water, ports, and similar, only had to be managed by the government. Now, of course, the Ecuadorian government did not have all of the technology, both in terms of the management knowledge required, and sometimes even the hardware or the mechanical technology to make that happen. So basically, it was a strategy of contracting suppliers, right? So for example, in the case of oil, it became state property, but then the state decided to contract some of the operation to private suppliers, right? Now, this is very different from privatization in our case, because the history of privatization in Latin America had been to completely outsource all of the management,
Yes.
even the property of the natural resource, to the private companies. But in Ecuador's case, the property of the natural resource and the business itself was government property, but there were, of course, private suppliers that were procured, that we procured with, to either build or manage some of the operation. Now, in the case of Ecuador, there was a strategic alliance signed in 2009 with China, where we decided basically that China would be our main partner for our infrastructure deployment.
So that was replacing World Bank,
Well,
basically.
the thing, it wasn't really replaced because the World Bank hadn't invested in Ecuador for almost 4 decades. So
Yeah.
all of the
They
policy,
just held debt, and
yeah,
that's
it was
basically,
you know, debt that was being you know, restructured all the time without new infrastructure projects. So in Ecuador, people had forgotten that you could actually build stuff and change the landscape or change the quality of services for people. So with the Chinese banks, actually money started to flow, not just to pay previous debt, sort of rollovering stuff, but also to actually build new things. And so that was a very, very powerful alliance that allowed for the construction of 8.
And not only that, it was like an incredible transformation of the Ecuadorian territory. I mean, like I remember arriving to Ecuador very early in the government of Correa, and you know, there were roads, and then there was like the infrastructure was not of any sort of like quality that you would mention, no, compared to infrastructure that gets developed everywhere. By the last time I had been in Ecuador, which was about 3-4 years ago, you know, the territorial transformation was immense. I mean, it reminded me to a certain extent to the people that say how the U.S. got transformed after the Second World War with all these highways and infrastructure and so on. There were like a great amount of projects that were there. So what you're saying is that most of these was done with the support of China. But also, I assume you had some local policies developed in order to continue progressing in this direction of sort of development, you know, which was, I think, one of the main discourses of Correa at that time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the China had an important role in terms of financing technology and the companies that were present there, but they couldn't have been done if we hadn't had a national development plan that it said that this all had to be done, right? So we had what's called the National Territorial Strategy, Estrategia Territorial Nacional in Spanish, part of our national development plan, which was a binding document for all governments, both local and national. And it established how we wanted to transform the territory of Ecuador with these, you know, as focal points and focus on a special sort of polos de desarrollo or development regions in Ecuador that were going to be specialized according to our capacity and so forth. And of course, infrastructure was a huge part of that, which gave the possibility of these projects to take hold and take place. Now, this was also possible because we strengthened the domestic institutions of development, right? We had a very powerful Ministry of Development. I was the Vice Minister of Planning and Development for a few years. And we had, you know, the arm of public investment. So in Ecuador, the Treasury, which was the Ministry of Finance, was not the one who decided how money was spent. They just made sure that the money was going to be available. But it was the planning ministry that took the decisions on how the money should be spent. Now, that, of course, changed the dynamics within the economy, right? And we also created, not really created, but we strengthened this institution called the Bank of the State, Banco del Estado. Now its name is different. It's called Banco de Desarrollo, Development Bank. And this was the bank that would give funding to local governments. So municipalities, prefectures, and the local parishes.
That would basically bring a development plan, and you know,
and it would monitor the local governments to see that they had a development plan, that it made sense, that they you know, had links with the territory and with the national strategy. And you know, it gave lots and lots of funding for example, a sanitation project, water projects in local sort of road infrastructure, recycling capacities, and management of waste management disposals and so forth. So it was it's a very powerful instrument that's still there, but of course that definitely helped change the landscape.
Yeah, and with all of these like really massive transformations that you created in very short time, which is incredible. I mean, to listen to, because it was really a few years where a lot of these transformations started to happen and completely change the panorama. But all of you in the government, I remember when we were talking, you were very, very aware of that Ecuador is a small country. It's a very small part of a continent that has been constantly battered by neoliberal capital, by American capital, by all kinds of imperial sort of denominations, colonial, etc. And you also were very conscious that this was not a country. Of course, the country was very important, but there were things or diplomacy that was being developed with other countries around Latin America, especially the left-leaning countries that were at that time, Bolivia. Of course, Venezuela is a different example, but we had coordinations with Chile, etc. What was the role? Because certainly you were pioneering a lot of these. I guess together with Bolivia, there were a lot of pioneering directions. No, what was that macro role that you saw that it was important to take, or they were taking?
We were aware that you couldn't build the socialism just in one country, especially not a small country like ours. So we were very explicit in our constitution in terms of regional integration, right? That's the concept. So how to build a strong Latin America, starting with a strong South America. We partnered with Lula in Brazil, with Evo in Bolivia, Chavez in Venezuela, and so forth, and Nestor Kirchner in Argentina, and many others, with a common plan for the region, right? So we wanted to build a financial infrastructure, financial architecture that would allow us to recycle all of the monetary wealth that the region had, but that was invested in Switzerland or Miami or New York. So how could we use those resources that we did have to invest in our future, in our common future? So we came up with the idea of the Bank of the South. We had this plan also within the UNASUR, which was called the Consejo Suramericano de Planificación, South American Planning, well. Which did still have some projects that were more oriented toward extractivist nature, basically with influence from the Inter-American Development Bank. But with time, it became a project that was more focused on regional integration, on facilitating movement of people within our region, on creating value chains for a powerful industrial sector that would have regional, sort of continental scale for South American countries, and also would invest in the research and development, technology, and so forth, to have what we call soberanía alimentaria, so agricultural and food sovereignty, so that we wouldn't depend on other regions for feeding our population, and also health sovereignty, to have our own medicine, our own vaccines, and so forth, which of course we weren't able to develop in full. Otherwise, we would have been in a much better position.
A paradise
in the last few years.
Yeah, and this brings me, back into sort of where a lot of the Latin American left was starting to have political problems. I mean, my experience working the Latin American left from Chavez Venezuela was my first experience, all the way into working with you guys in Ecuador, Chile, etc. Is that there was a period where there was some trust, I think, globally on all the networks, the left-leaning networks, the progressive parties, and so on, that was building there. But the right-wing parties and the neoliberal capital, the global capital, were constantly battering and everything from media structures to monetary lines to, as you say, banking and so forth. And it's very clear that something started to give a turn, right? I mean, something happened that allowed a lot of right-wing governments to begin to take, again, possession of the power that they had and continue doing the damage that they had been doing for so many decades.
Right. So in terms of history, hopefully historians and people that study these kinds of things will study a key decision taken by the government of Barack Obama, which was to reinstate the Fourth Fleet which is basically a fleet, a combination of submarines, submarines, large ships and so forth, carriers, that would start to roam around the Western Hemisphere, right? Obama and the US had decided to not have the Fourth Fleet for a long time, but then Obama reinstated the Fourth Fleet. And some people think this is just sort of a marine or navigational type thing. But when the Fourth Fleet started to be redeployed to the Western Hemisphere around the coasts of Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and so forth, together with the Fourth Fleet became, came the rest of the sort of hybrid war deployment, which included aggressive media strategies, sanctions against many of the governments in Latin America, a new type of funding for foreign influence in the domestic agendas, and so forth. So it was a very explicit decision to try to put a stop on this progressive and socialist agenda.
So a very differently kind of orchestrated shock then.
Right, yeah, it was a military operation, and it can be studied, and all the documents are there. And it was people in several think tanks that came up with this sort of overarching strategy to try to put a break on the agenda of progressives in the region, which was, the key point would have been regional integration, because that was going to create, the long-term institutions to allow for a more sovereign path towards the rights of good living, or the rights of people. That's why, that one of the first things that was destroyed by these conservative forces once they took power in Latin America was to quit UNASUR, for example, to quit the Union of South American Nations. This is the equivalent of, for example, killing the European Union. If a right-wing force gets elected in France or in Italy, quitting the European Union and basically balkanizing again the region. That's the equivalent of what happened.
Yeah, it's like it would have been like an extension of Brexit, but like a complete disintegration, of all the economic unity that they had. Yeah. And then adding to all of this, of course, I think it's something very important that you experienced a lot as you were very recently the forerunner, the number one runner in the presidential election, right, in Ecuador, which I assume the media outlet continues to be a very big influence, and there's many strategies, of course, that are employed on it, but that has been, and without doubt continues to be, one of the main influences from the rise of the right. Do you sense that is the case, or do you think that is winning, or how is that moving?
Yeah, I think the media is definitely a very, very powerful force in Latin America, as in the rest of the world, especially concentrated media, corporate media. And we haven't had a smart strategy from the sectors of the left and the progressive movements to try to overcome this radical situation, right? So because media hides under the veil of freedom of expression and freedom of the press, and it becomes a very powerful narrative, of course, to try to battle the media with the curtain and that veil they have. But we're talking about here economic concentration, right? A lot of media power in the hands of very few people. So media inequality is a very important phenomenon that has to be not only studied but acted upon. And we need to build alliances between public broadcasters, university broadcasters, broadcasters from underdeveloped and peripheral regions of the world, organizations of workers' unions and people from the countryside, campesinos. We need a real union, and of course we need to battle the media narratives that are now have overtaken even the social media sphere. So there's a lot to do in terms of media regulation.
And on that front, you have been very active on many of these things. Not only on this front, but in many fronts. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about this, because I'm always very intrigued about how your career is developing. And after obviously being many of us thought. I mean, I think that you were going to be the president of Ecuador, right? Independently of that, if you were not, you already had a very a specific direction in which you wanted to approach, what's the future? I mean, the future is coming. You started to work on the Observatory of Dollarization. You became a member of the Progressive International, right? Which is something I would like to hear about. You were also working on the Bank of the South, these other organizations. And recently you've been working a lot on the sort of issues about special drawing rights of the IMF, and how to counter those things, and with a very wide global network, right? So I would love to know what are the spaces of operation that you are involved in, and how do you sense those, right, as we move into the future?
Right, so you could say I'm in broadly three spaces of operation, all of them with a global reach. One of them, which has to do with Latin American integration. So everything has to do with Latin American integration, both political, productive, financial, commercial, trade, and knowledge, university-wide. It's all about building a project that transcends each of our countries, right? It has to have a regional dimension. And that's being possible now because of the second wave of left and progressive governments that are arriving to the landscape in Latin America.
Peru,
yes. That's sort of one of the spaces of operation. I'm also a member of Grupo de Puebla. I'm a protagonist in the Progressive International, especially in the Latin American region. I'm working together with many Latin American social movements on regional integration and building a new financial architecture for the region and so forth. The second space of operation is the one that has to do with the knowledge, right? So with opening up knowledge, democratizing knowledge, working on this media reform, working on everything that we can do to create what's called the sovereignty of knowledge, soberanía del conocimiento. The possibility.
Yeah, and this is something that began in Ecuador. Well, you were also involved in the Ministry of Knowledge. Right. You were the Minister.
I was the Minister of Knowledge, and fortunately, I have some capacities and abilities in that area. Where, for example, we're proposing an digital ecosystem for government transactions, for electronic commerce that allows, those that are underprivileged and that have been on the sort of weak side of political and economic negotiations to actually have a chance. And we can build an agenda of knowledge for the many, right? Not for the few. So that's another agenda that I'm permanently working on, which includes, of course, patent reform and intellectual property issues, biodiversity issues, and others. And then the third aspect, which is the one that perhaps I have a little more technical capacity in, is the one that has to do with the international financial system. And I'm working there on basically as a watchdog of the IMF and of the big banks. My thesis is on the international payment system and capital and cross-border flows. And I'm sort of trying to understand how the thing that makes the world go around, which is money, how it's governed, who are the people in charge, what we can do from the people who believe in socialist principles and also in sovereignty of peoples around the world to make a transformation there. One example is the special drawing rights, which I'd like to explain quickly. Special drawing rights is it's basically a currency of the IMF that's very little known. It was created in 1969. It was first issued in 1971. And unlike everything else the IMF does, these special drawing rights are basically donations that are created politically in a gathering of all the countries in the world, and they vote to literally create more money, okay? They vote to create more money. So this is, almost science fiction. People are like, whatever, man.
It is, yes.
But it really is like that. And when the pandemic struck early last year, I wrote a piece in the Financial Times saying it's time for an SDR injection, right? So we need these SDRs, this arcane instrument that was developed in the late 60s, early 70s, when the world was a different place. But we know the instrument legally still exists, so we need to revive it, resurrect it, and make it massive to basically help people, because the pandemic has hit everybody. Everybody needs help, and of course, the peoples of the third world need more of this. So I called for a 3 trillion issuance of special drawing rights on March 12th, and fortunately, people listened. The director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, at the time, only 8 days later, basically supported this as well. And unfortunately, the Trump administration, and with the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin, decided to veto this, right?
Yes, of course, because it goes against the interest, of course.
So the US vetoed this for 17 months, well into the Biden administration. But fortunately, in August of this year, the SDRs were issued, not the 3 trillion, but $650 billion worth of SDRs were distributed to every country in the world, except for 3 for geopolitical reasons. One of them, Myanmar, that had a coup. Afghanistan, that had a coup, a couple of days before that.
And North Korea, I assume, right?
North Korea is not a member of the IMF, so they didn't get any. But the third one, believe it or not, was Venezuela, because supposedly they didn't know who the president was. But that was the third country that didn't get the SDRs, but everybody else in the world did. And now what I'm working on is the IMF transferred those SDRs in most countries to the central banks. But as you know, and as we've discussed earlier, central banks are usually captured by neoliberal technocrats or directly by the bankers themselves. So what I'm working on now is how to get those SDRs out of the central banks to the government budgets, so that they can have more control by parliament, by civil society, with much more accountability and transparency, and so that it is spent on people, not on banks' finances, right? That's what I'm working on, and we're having.
But it's a very large organization, right? I mean, like it's many people around the world. It's a big network, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is not something that is just that is truly emerging, as a movement.
Yeah, it's a huge coalition. You have people there from faith-based organizations such as the Jubilee movement. That has branches and brothers and sisters are all around the world. You have organizations such as Oxfam, that are permanently thinking about issues such as inequality, Christian aid, organizations that are in favor of transparency, organizations that have been permanently in favor of debt restructuring for the third world. Think tanks in Washington, D.C., and organizations in favor of economic and social justice in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, and so forth. So we've even gathered, several heads of state that are supporting our efforts, like the Prime Minister of Barbados, recently, most recent independent country in the world.
Yes, exactly.
But even people that you wouldn't expect this from, like the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, has said, we need these SDRs right away, and we even have support of the IMF staff. So this is actually a pretty wide coalition, and that is making a dent in the functioning of the system, and which actually caused a coup attempt. I'll say this in a few seconds, but there was an op-ed published by Kristalina Georgieva, the director of the IMF, on CNBC a few months ago, saying, look, there is no such thing as a shortage of money. If we want to fight climate change, we can issue as many SDRs as we want. There is no shortage of money, right? Can you believe that from the head of the IMF saying something like that?
Yes.
So the week later, there was a coup attempt staged against her, in the words of Joseph Stiglitz, from the US government's administration, from the Treasury, Trump appointee called David Malpass, who's now the head of the World Bank, saying that, Kristalina Georgieva is just a China stooge or whatever, and we have to kick her out.
That's amazing.
But she survived this coup attempt, and of course now the SDRs are gaining ground in the political discussion around the world, because all of a sudden, oh wow, there's infinite money that can be democratically created and distributed around the world. That
Yeah.
definitely, if we appropriate this, that definitely changes the way of
Yeah.
relating to the big banks and so forth.
No, and this is a topic that I wish we had so much more time to talk about, because perhaps in the next interview, Andres, because there's a reason also why the green economies, right, the sort of the new sort of developmental economics that are coming, and the capturing of those green economies by capitalist forces, and so there's a whole background, on the on one hand, it's fantastic. There's enough available money for combating climate change. Yes, it needs to be a global network, but there's so many hidden sort of parts in which what is pushing this, right, from a developmental perspective, and that would be an amazing sort of a next interview. As a matter of fact, the one of the next podcasts that I'm working on is precisely on issues on circular economy and issues relating to environment and so forth, and that would be very nice, at least to get your opinion on this. Now, I want to push this discussion, Andres, into one aspect that you might not be too comfortable with, which is a little bit, thinking more in the utopian or fantastic space of of the future, right? I mean, we know that we are facing a lot of things, but you just laid out three very important sort of spaces of operation that you're working together with. And one of them is integration. I mean, you mentioned about integration, regional integration. But I assume, of course, that with this last project, you're talking about global integration, right? I mean, the idea of unity, of a unitary strategy that is global and not just, based on specific countries. You also are working on the topic, which is knowledge, right? And the democratization, the emancipation of certain kinds of knowledges that would allow the proliferation of democratic instruments and decision making. And then lastly, in this one, you're working on money governance and in politics that or policy issues that very few people understand, but are so important to determine how governments have access to money in a democratic form and redistribute it equally, let's put it that way. What do you see this as a result? I mean, imagine yes, we achieve integration. We achieve, well, we don't achieve, but we advance a lot in knowledge, in the knowledge production, in the money governance, which is what you're fighting for. Can you let our listeners know what would be your ultimate vision of the society that will come out of this?
Look, for me, this approach is to reach good living, or buen vivir. Right. So
yes, coming back to that. Yes.
That's our utopia. Yeah. That's our utopia. That's where we're doing all this for. This is where we strive, what we're striving for. Buen vivir, this harmonic relationship between all of humanity and the relation between humanity and its future generations, but not only with as an anthropocentric perspective, but with a biocentric perspective, which includes a relationship with all of the species in our natural habitat, which is the planet Earth. So, I mean, for me, it is really a possible path forward for society, because it's the only way of guaranteeing the survival of our species, right? And Fidel Castro wrote about this before his death almost 10 years ago. And we really need the buen vivir, right? So several things on how to understand this. When we hear, on the street or in political slogans, we need to live better or build back better, or, with the use of the term better. The use of the term better doesn't have to be contrasted with worse. It has to be contrasted with good, right? So do we always need to be better? What do we understand by better? So if we earn, $1 million or $1 billion, do we need two of those? No, we just need what's enough. We need what's enough. And sure, maybe the definition of enough does change over time, but I assure you, it does not include the obscene inequality we're living in now in this neoliberal paradigm, right?
Absolutely.
So we need to contrast this better perspective with a good perspective, right? So good living buen vivir doesn't have to be permanently vivir mejor or better living. There is a limit.
Yeah, because better, as you say, equates to growth and all these kinds of things.
And it becomes an
accumulation.
infinity, and then it is not, biophysically consistent with this planet. And I think the elites in the planet are aware of this, and that's why all of this space exploration has been assumed even as part of the most recent intent to privatize, instead of it being humanity through its global and government agencies trying to explore the outer world. Now it's what is it, billionaires now exploring the outer world. And in the Obama government, you saw the 2016 asteroid exploitation act being passed. Like, what the hell, we're already looking into how to privatize mining assets and asteroids for profit. So this issue of the lack of resources for such an unequal world in this planet is definitely one that we have to analyze. Now, the other part of this utopia and how we reach there is, I think, building common ground with people that are, conscious about the present and future needs of society and humanity and the planet, all around the planet. So it can't just be the elites in the city or in Washington or in Berlin or in Brussels. We need this to be a planetary movement where we gather forces from the third world, from allied social movements all over the planet. And that's why the Progressive International is so important. And that's why I'm committed to this space, right? Because we need coordination, south and north, east and west, and we will find plenty of common ground. We don't all have to think exactly alike, but I'm sure that we can find a common ground for an international movement of this sort, and hopefully to put the good living and the paradigm change on the center. Now, this has many implications, because if you agree with this utopia of having what's enough for a harmonious relationship between all of humanity and with nature and for the future generations, then you need to start thinking about how we measure all of those things, right? How we measure all those things.
And it has to be reinvented completely.
And we have to reinvent it. And there are some lights, that have been there, but GDP and, like monetary wealth and whatever,
totally useless.
No, they're useless. We need new ways of measuring rights Absolutely. Of nature, rights of humans, rights of communities, and so forth. And that's when we need a complete paradigm change, where the academia has been extremely behind in terms of the challenges of society, but we also need to basically overhaul the entire accounting framework of how our society is measured.
You can sort of end this podcast even more beautifully. I mean, absolutely, and we are, I think the majority of our listeners are also in their own way working on this, and hopefully we can just begin to build more and more collectivities and more alliances to achieve this goal, which is definitely something that I believe we all need at this point. Is more the capacity to imagine a better and a good, to say the word, a good future, and not fall into the dystopian sort of dialogues, that have plagued society at the moment. I want to thank you a lot, Andres, for being the podcast. It has been absolutely an honor and amazing. And I honestly will invite you back to talk about these issues on environmental economies, but also perhaps we can discuss more on Progressive International with some of your colleagues, right? And what are they doing? What are you guys doing? Thank you, Andres.
Thank you, Miguel. It's been a pleasure.
This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.